Faithless Hijabi provides a supportive community for young people who have left the faith, along with access to mental health services and resources. But they need your help to continue their important work. Please consider donating to Faithless Hijabi and help make a difference in the lives of these young people. Together, we can provide them with the support they need to heal and thrive.
Without further ado, I do have my first question for you, Maryam. So in the past, we've had so many other uprisings in Iran. How is this front different? And how have the recent Iran protests impacted the status and visibility of women's rights and freedom within the country?
Mm. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be supporting Faithless Hijabi for the amazing work that you're doing, and you, Zara, as well. It's just so great to be here and to do, however small an action, to support the work that you're doing. And it's great that we're doing something with Susanna, of course, on the protests in Iran, because, I mean, the reality is it's a really exciting moment in not just the history of Iran, but I think the history of the fight for human liberation. And I think in that sense, you can see why so many people are excited about the women's revolution in Iran and are supporting it, and are looking to it as a source of hope for real change in Iran against the Islamist movement, but also something that could really bring a new change in the region and across the globe. Because we know that when the Islamic regime was established in 1979, after after it stole an Iranian revolution against the Shah's dictatorship, and suppressed and killed into an entire generation, really, to get into power at that time. It's been a really bleak world, and we've seen the rise of not just Islamic fundamentalism, but all types of fundamentalisms: Hindu, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, because, of course, they feed into each other, they help each other, they are recruiting grounds for each other. And so I think that's, we're living in, hopefully, a time of women's revolutions, because we also have the women's revolution in Rojava in Syrian Kurdistan. So I think why this is different, of course, is, as you said, Zara, there's been so many protests in Iran, because obviously we know that living under a theocracy is antithetical to 21st century life. But this one is different in the sense that there are no more illusions towards any aspect of the Islamic regime, because if you remember, in the past, there were the so-called reformists, and people thought, oh, they're better than the conservatives. And we always said from the beginning that they're the same. They're just, they're just mullahs which have smiley face stickers on their faces, but they're doing the exact same things. And it was just a difference in strategy. The reformers were saying, if we at least talk about reform, we won't be overthrown, because there's so much hatred against our regime. And the conservatives were like, no, if we open up even a little bit, that's the end of us. So it was really a strategic difference. And this time, you're looking at a Generation Z that has no illusions towards Islamic rule. They actually hate the theocracy. And you can see that in the slogans, which are modern, which are secular, which are woman-centered. And it's, hugely anti-clerical. It reminds me of how it must have been during the French Revolution, where they were trying to pull down the church's role and influence in the state. It's the same sort of thing, the turban flying phenomenon, where young people run up behind mullahs and throw their turbans off, burning hijabs, removing hijabs. If you look at, for example, funerals of people who've been killed, it's not the usual Shia mourning. It's dancing, it's celebration. You have some young man like Majid Rahnavard, who's walking towards his execution, and the Iranian state TV asks him, "What's your last will and testament?" He's blindfolded. He's surrounded by men with masks on because he's on his way to execution. And he says, "I want you not to pray for me, not to mourn. I want you to dance. I want you to celebrate. Don't read the Quran for me." Or the mother of Kian Pirfalak, he's a 9-year-old who was killed by the regime. At his funeral, she said, "Don't read the Quran at my son's funeral. He hated the Quran." So you're seeing this sort of anti-religious backlash, something we've talked about actually for many, many decades, but we're seeing it now come to fruition. So I think it's an exciting time, but we also have to remember that it's also, you know, these brave people, these women and men on the street, many of them very young, shouting for woman life freedom and end to theocracy. They're being suppressed brutally by the regime. You know, over 500 killed. You've got 70 at least who've been 18 and under, 18 to 20,000 people arrested, rape as a tool of sexual violence. All of these things are happening, and business is going on very much as usual in the rest of the world with regards Western governments and how they're reacting to this regime. So we need to keep that pressure on. We need to support it if we believe this is a new era of women's revolutions, and I think it is.
I think that's incredibly powerful, and it really just, you know, I often think about how a lot of people here, at the very least in the United States, certainly some of the professors that I've had will say things like, this is the type of lifestyle that they really enjoy over there. This very moral relativistic understanding of how societies function. But as time moves on, as you said, it just doesn't seem to be the case. People don't want to live like this, and it's great that we have so many powerful, incredible voices speaking up and actually performing action to their words. So I think, you know, I tend to be a pretty pessimistic guy. I shouldn't be, but it's really hard not to just be filled with some level of optimism about the state of the world and about the future state of the world. And I think in general, just about how we treat each other as human beings and what direction we want to take that towards, basically.
Very beautifully said. I think, I mean, I think if we're activists, there is a level of optimism that we always have, because you've got to have this sort of optimism and hope that things can change. Otherwise, I think the world can be so depressing that I think I couldn't get out of bed if I wasn't an activist. You know what I mean? Because you do just get so pulled down. But I think, and for me, you know how they say you either see the glass half empty or half full. I always kind of see it half full, and I think you need to do that psychologically, mentally, in order to be able to carry on, because there is so much suffering in this world, not just in Iran, but even where we live. You know, from homelessness, poverty, just so many injustices that we see every day as we're just walking in the streets. So I think activism does make me personally, I feel like it's also a type of therapy for me. But I think also this whole, you know, as you said, this whole moral relativism and cultural relativism, I mean, for how many decades they have used that as an excuse to allow for the violation of women's rights, particularly because when it comes to culture, it's usually the domain of women, you know, because women are the property of the men, of the culture, of the religion, of the nation, all of that. And I think with Iran, it's such a great example to show that, I'm sorry, that no, you know, it's not people's culture to want to be stoned and to want to be flogged for not fasting during Ramadan and for not wanting to wear the veil. So this is a live sort of rejection of that, which I think is a great victory for those of us who've been saying it for so long. And I think it's harder now for people to make that argument.
I think what frustrates me so much about a lot of the misconceptions that we have, that I think have been like, because of the filter through like Western media is I see like a continued dismissing and diminishing of the demands of the protesters. And it feels like such a slap in the face because like some common misconceptions I hear are like, oh, well, this is like not about Islam. This has nothing to do with Islam. And Iranians are just fighting to remove the headscarf. They just don't want the mandatory headscarf. And they just want to abolish the morality police. Like these are just their demands, And like what people fail to understand is that those are reform-based talking points because they're saying, okay, we're just going to change this policy, right? Instead of what you hear in the streets are unequivocally, we want regime change. We want a different government. We want an end to clerical rule. And there's one chant that translates to, until the mullahs are shrouded, this homeland is not a homeland. Like you cannot get more clear in your demands that this is about a systematic overhaul instead of just what, maybe in the West we would think, oh, an end to morality police, an end to mandatory hijab, that's a victory. No, we're failing to fully appreciate that that's not considered a victory at this point. It's not reflective of the real demands of the people who are sacrificing themselves for the values that they want their nation to have. Yeah, I think that's very frustrating to me is when I hear that from people who are supposed to be very authoritative.
Yeah.
I mean, can I just add something to that, if that's okay? Is that all right? Yeah. I mean, I think what this generation has come to recognize is that you cannot reform an Islamic state to be woman-friendly in the same way you can't reform the racial apartheid regime to be friendly towards Black and brown people. You can't reform, a fascist regime to be nice to those that it considers the Untermensch or whatever, the subhumans. I mean, that's just the reality of things. And also we have to remember that the regime, I mean, it's a theocracy. So if you end, let's say, hijab rules, which would be impossible for the regime to do because its very existence is based on a religious rule, and women are the suppression of women and the covering of women and the sex segregation of women, women having less rights than men and so on. It's a pillar of the regime. So it's, if it bans the morality police and if it allows for women not to wear the hijab and so on, it stops being an Islamic state. And I think that's what people don't maybe understand. They look at it as a normal state where people are fighting for reforms. And the reality is that they still don't, I think, understand the level of misogyny and brutality that is part and parcel of a religious state. I mean, we keep giving the example of Handmaid's Tale, because that is it. I mean, you can have certain reforms, it'll never be enough because this whole the whole state is set up to be anti-women, misogynist, and anti-human, and you've got to get rid of it. I mean, the only thing I would say is that I'm wary of using the term regime change because I think that there was an attempt to change regimes in 1979 where we saw that the Shah's dictatorship was then regime changed from above to an Islamic dictatorship. And now again, we see that the Shah's son is vying for political power and he's talking about regime change from above. And the reality is that this is a revolution, and a revolution is something that happens from below. It's a demand from the people. And I think, the great thing is that a lot of people are calling it a revolution, and revolutions are kind of not the same as regime change. So I think, it's important to support the women's revolution if we want to see real change and not just regime change from above, where a lot of the same rules will still remain and apply.
So, Susanna, this leads me to, want to ask, well, on that note, how can the international community support the efforts of protesters in Iran towards greater human rights and liberation? And what long-term impact do you see coming from these protests on the global human rights movement?
Well, I think globally, one of the major successes, in my opinion, is that the Iranian people have made it clear that they are not their government, which I think was a common misunderstanding for a very long time. Like their attitudes and demands are not reflected in their government, and because it makes that whole argument of like, oh, this is just their culture so much less salient when you see like the videos that Maryam was talking about of people burning their hijabs to great acclaim, or Keon's mother saying he hated the Quran. What stands out to me about that video is that the crowd cheers. They celebrate her saying that. So that shows the mass approval of such an anti-Islamic statement, right? Like that level of public acceptance of that rejection is something a lot of my friends never expected to see, like in their lifetime, so boldly. And so I think it's been a great success that finally the demands of the people are being recognized more widely, understood more widely. I mean, obviously there's still a lot of misconceptions, but there's progress, right? I think the profile of the incredible work that Iranian feminist activists are doing has also been raised. And I think that's of huge benefit to this movement in general. Like it for lack of a better term, it was put on the map in a way it hasn't been for a very long time, in my opinion. And I'm really happy to see that recognition of, you know, people, including our very own Maryam, who have done so much to push the conversations and the feminist thought from this region forward, like such great lengths. How can we support on the outside as an international audience? It kind of depends on your region. I think where you have a more active Iranian diaspora community in your region, you might be able to do more. So I've been involved in a lot of local communities in whatever city I'm staying in at the time. And I like to talk to them and just figure out what their needs are for their community. So in my community, it might be, okay, well, right now we're working to talk to our local elected representatives because we want them to pass, you know, a statement through our city council, or we are trying to get a act approved on a federal level, like talk to your representatives. And in a broader sense, I think we have a duty to keep our eye on the situation and continue to monitor the situation. I think as an international audience, so to speak, or allies, in showing our solidarity, we have to continue to commit ourselves to the fact that this isn't over yet, right? And it's going to be a long-term process, and that means that we can't allow this to fall off the radar and allow approval and vocal approval, I should say, to drop. We need to, really stay vigilant in supporting the people who are still facing consequences for the way in which they came together and showed themselves in the street. They're still facing consequences to this day, and we owe a duty to them to pay attention to what they're going through.
Can I just add to that as well? Is that okay?
Go for it. Yeah,
I mean, I think the thing is, it's not over yet, as Susanna says, for sure. But I think it is the beginning of the end. And obviously, it's a process and it's going to take time. But as she says, we need to keep focus on it. We need to keep attention on it. And luckily, we live in the age of social media where people are now able to speak for themselves in a way that was never allowed when it was, when everything was in the hands of a few media. And therefore, we're now able to see the realities of what's happening. And in addition to, things that we can do is also to call for the shutting down of Iranian embassies, expulsion of Iranian regime ambassadors, defending those who are in prison. Someone like Sohail Arabi, this wonderful atheist ex-Muslim who's so brave. And I know Faithless Hijabi has supported, as has Atheist Republic, of course, all of our ex-Muslim organizations. So those are the sorts of things we can do. And it really does work. If I just want to give you a quick example, the UN Commission on the Status of Women, imagine Iran was on that commission. It's the highest body internationally of that promotes gender equality. Can you imagine, women's equality? And because of pressure, Iran is the first country in the entire world that has been kicked out of the commission. So it does work when we work together. And now we've started a campaign. I'm a signatory of it. And of course, everyone can join. And it's to call on the international body to consider sex apartheid as a crime against humanity. Racial apartheid is considered a crime against humanity, but sex apartheid isn't. And it's something that's being done in support of women in Iran and Afghanistan. So these are various ways in which we can keep putting the pressure on. It is working, and we've just got to make sure that we don't allow governments to just carry on with business as usual. No, this is not business as usual. This is the beginning of the end of that regime. And the least governments can do, as one banner said, we don't need you to save Iranian women, but we do need you to stop saving our murderers. And I think that is the message we need to keep repeating.
I actually had a question. I think, Susanna, you mentioned this about people saying it's not Islam, it's political leaders, and kind of diluting the whole conversation, almost as though they can't really take it at face value. But
yeah, I don't think they can.
No, I think
actually
they
don't
want
think they
to
can.
No, it was really surprising. I heard your talk last week, or I think it was earlier this week, and you covered a lot of interesting points in terms of how people are negligent with actually calling spade a spade. And I wanted to ask, I guess, in your experience, not being Iranian, but still vouching for those rights, and I know, knowing you as a person, I know that comes to you very naturally as well. You're quite fierce and feisty, of course, and I think it's lovely. But I guess I wanted to understand a bit more of the pushback you receive from other international communities. I don't know if you get, I mean, I'm sure you get called Islamophobic, but I think specifically in the context of the Iranian protests, I wanted to understand more about the backlash.
Honestly, I can't say that I don't feel like I have received any backlash for being involved the way I have been at an Iranian level. I mean, honestly, I just show up and I get involved with my local Iranian American community, and they're just so grateful, and they will just be so effusive in their thanks for me just showing up, which for me is actually disappointing because I'm just showing up. Like, to me, that's the minimum that I could do, right? I mean, I used to get a lot more backlash in general for what I do about, publicly criticizing Islam and stuff like that. But I don't feel like I've experienced that from an Iranian context at all, actually.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this to Maryam a while ago when we did the panel in Ghent. You remember that, Maryam? But it was, I guess for me, it was interesting.
That makes me laugh.
We just had some really interesting chats in Ghent. But I guess what I received was people on the outside being convinced that these are done by spies, terrorists, or
you do hear some of that. Yeah.
And
that
I'm
this
just
is all a Saudi conspiracy. I hear that.
Yeah, or like, I remember like my community is Shia crazy. And they were like, one of this, and I think, Susanna, you know him, Sayyid Amar Naqshbani, like, Shia preacher. So I know him quite well. He does a lot of like very close to Tanzania, which is very close to Iran, apparently, not geographically. And he was like, I don't have the entire truth in Iran, so I can't support either side. And I'm like, it's very point blank. No matter what your beliefs, you just don't kill people. You do not torture them for not wearing the dress you want them to. And it still surprises me how people were so many Muslims as well were so appealed with his advocacy of not taking a side. And I just don't think it's okay to not take a side, no matter what. Like, no matter what.
Naqshbani in particular is like that. He couches his opinions in a very peculiar way, like, because he aligns partially with Khamenei, so, but he like doesn't want to pick a side between this other Ayatollah Grand Marja. So I'm not surprised.
I mean, I think again, because we as we mentioned, the realities of what we're seeing is very different than the propaganda we've heard for many decades. The whole cultural relativism that Vincent mentioned, the whole Islamophobia accusations whenever there's any criticism. So it is kind of a shock, and people go back to their comfort zone, which is that it's got nothing to do with Islam, because it's easier to make that argument, even though you can see, even at face value, that there's something very different going on, and there is that backlash taking place. And I mean, I think also, you do have this sort of accusation that it's, I mean, I've heard it not just from people who are obviously pro the Iranian regime, but a lot of the sort of left that supported Islamists and accused us of Islamophobia. I say that as someone who's very much on the left myself, who see it as this is happening because of Western intervention. And, my question to them is, how come when you're striking for against the privatization of the NHS, the Tories have decimated the health service in this country? How come when you're fighting for refugee rights, it's not Western intervention, it's not an act of imperialism, because it's the right to protest against oppression, against unjust laws, and you have very much a right to do that, and I'm there with you. But how come when people in Iran have that protest, it becomes something that's being orchestrated by Mossad or by the Western intelligence services? Since when is, Western intelligence services and Mossad in favor of women's rights, gay rights, the liberation of people? I mean, it's absurd when you take it for a little further and ask these questions. So I think it's just people falling back into their lazy conceptions that have been easy for them. And I think we have to help work them through this, as we have on many occasions, with regards to the rights of ex-Muslims, Islamophobia, the right not to veil, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we're just on time, and we wanted you guys to talk so much that we did not put any audience questions, because hearing you both talk is like music to my ears. So.
Aw, thank you for having us, Zara.
Yeah,
It's really an
was
honor.
lovely. Thank you, Zara. Thank you, Vincent. And again, we love the work at CNB that Faithless Hijabi is doing. And, if anyone's watching, definitely it's an organization that needs to be supported. And donate if you can, because this is work that needs support. And unfortunately, a lot of the work we do, it's considered controversial. It's not that sort of thing that you get, money thrown at you, even though, of course, the Islamists will say we're all in it for the money. And, we're all rich because we criticize Islam. But actually, they're the ones that have money thrown at them. If you defend religion, you can be sure you're going to get lots of money, but not if you're critical of religion and defending people who are traumatized and shunned and ostracized because they don't want to be believers anymore.
Yeah, I completely agree. Faithless Hijabi does such good work, and I actually know people personally who have benefited from the services that you guys provide. So I'm really grateful and honored to be asked to help you guys, raise more money to do even better work.
Thank you so much, guys.
Fantastic seeing you guys. Fantastic.
Thanks.
Yes, great
Have
to
a good
see
rest
all of
evening.
you. I missed you.
Good to see you, Susanna, as well.
Susanna.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.